The pandemic was a major obstacle for President Trump's re-election campaign, and now it appears to be a key factor in a growing split within one of his critical constituencies, evangelical Christians. A recent Yahoo News report looks at the contrasting responses to COVID-19 restrictions and how it highlights a rift among some in the evangelical community. Some feel they're being persecuted during the outbreak, while others say they should count their blessings. Jon Ward wrote that article, and he joins me now. He is a senior political correspondent for Yahoo News. Welcome, Jon. Thanks very much for being with us. Well, as we just mentioned, the pandemic is revealing this split among some evangelicals. You've said that there have been these long-standing differences, but right now, what are these different perspectives that we're seeing?
Hey, Elaine. Yeah, the differences, I think, can come down to a gathering you saw on the National Mall. It was about a week before the election, and there was a young man named Sean Foyt who had basically a rock band on a stage. And this was the culmination of a series of concerts that he held around the country. He got a lot of criticism because he would have these gatherings and would not encourage people to wear masks. A lot of the criticism came from other evangelical Christians. In fact, in one concert, there was a young woman named D.L. Mayfield, who is in Portland, who held a sign quoting from the book of Amos in the Bible, basically saying, you know, I will not hear, this is the voice of God speaking, I will not hear your loud songs. I want to see justice roll down like a river. So it highlighted a split within evangelicalism that definitely is more pronounced among younger white evangelicals about attitudes about public health, science, and politics. And it was really interesting to see it play out. We can talk more about the specifics of that if you want.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about what we saw a few months ago. So when the pandemic hit and some states went into lockdown, President Trump threatened at one point to override governors to open churches back up. And I want to play some of what the president had to say about that. This is from May. Let's take a listen.
Today, I'm identifying houses of worship, churches, synagogue, and mosques as essential places that provide essential services. Some governors have deemed liquor stores and abortion clinics as essential, but have left out churches and other houses of worship. It's not right. So I'm correcting this injustice and calling houses of worship essential. The governors need to do the right thing and allow these very important essential places of faith to open right now for this weekend. If they don't do it, I will override the governors. In America, we need more prayer, not less.
So since those remarks, we know that millions more people in the U.S. have contracted the virus. More than 230,000 have died. But in some circles, preventative health measures were seen as infringing on religious liberty. Jon, help us understand that sentiment. How deeply held is that belief among some in the U.S.?
I think Trump's remarks there are useful in looking at the example of a church here in D.C. where I live. Capitol Hill Baptist is a church on Capitol Hill, as is indicated in the name. They were upset with the city's restrictions on public worship, which is what the Trump comments there are getting at. And Capitol Hill Baptist basically went through every measure they could go. They petitioned the city. They made numerous requests to the city to try to let them worship outside with masks and social distancing. And it wasn't until all of those options had been exhausted that they filed a lawsuit, which was successful. On the other hand, you have folks like the people I mentioned in those outdoor gatherings without masks. They represent the point of view that the government is basically infringing on their rights by even asking them to wear a mask. It doesn't really make a lot of sense because there is no mandate, but it's been politicized really by the president's own refusal to wear a mask. And it plays into longstanding attitudes that are prominent among religious conservatives about the idea that the government is out to control their freedom, to take away their freedoms. It's a bit odd, I think, for a lot of conservative Christians to worry about this idea of persecution. But, I do think there was legitimate complaints. I think people across the spectrum agreed that there were legitimate complaints about restrictions on worship in some places. The question, as we see in the example of Capitol Hill Baptist, is how to respond to that. That's a large part of what the piece was about, not really so much about is there a legitimate complaint here about restrictions on worship, but more so to the point of how are different camps within Christianity responding to what they perceive to be an unfair restriction.
I know you've written a lot about the evangelical community, including with respect to racial issues. And at times, this fight against the coronavirus has merged with this national debate or conversation about racial injustice. What kinds of discussions have taken place or are taking place in evangelical circles when it comes to this issue of race and racial equality?
Well, how long do you have? That's a very complicated subject. I think when George Floyd was first killed in late May, there was universal horror at what had happened to him, and I think there was a lot of sort of new receptiveness, even among conservative Christians, to this conversation about systemic racism. But I think what happened as the summer went on is that the president began to criticize some of the protests. There was violence in some of these cities, which I think the president then used to try to gain a political advantage. And I think at that point, there began to be a split where a lot of conservatives began to not be as receptive to this conversation. It's a conversation that makes most white conservatives, most white people, uncomfortable. But this move over the summer to focus more on the incidents of violence rather than the large mass outpouring of peaceful protest in response to George Floyd, that was sort of the departure point. I also should mention that around July, there was a pronounced focus on social media among a lot of white evangelicals about sex trafficking, which has some very strange overlap with the QAnon conspiracy theory. This is a really, really complicated and often confusing topic, but there is no question. I did some studies of some prominent conservative Christian leaders. One in particular was just so interesting. Up until about July, there was no mention of sex trafficking on his social media. And then at a certain point, I still don't understand exactly why this is, but every post every day began to talk about this issue, use hashtags that were part of QAnon, and so sort of start talking about some of the QAnon conspiracy theories, which really are bizarre.
In our final minutes, Jon, I want to ask you what evangelicals see as the legacy of the partnership that they forged with President Trump, and where do conservative Christians, especially evangelicals who supported the president, see themselves in a Biden administration? What happens now with sort of that political kind of momentum and influence that they had built?
I think many conservative evangelicals will remain I don't know if the word is loyal, but I think they will continue to defend their support for President Trump. And, remains to be seen what happens over the next 2 months in terms of whether he how he conducts himself as we head closer and closer to the new incoming Biden administration. And I think as far as how they feel about the Biden administration, I think a lot remains to be seen, or at least some of that remains to be seen. I think there is an awareness on Joe Biden's part that this is a group of people that feels fairly or not, whether we think it's fairly or not, feels beleaguered and is a large voting bloc. So there's ways to think about that are pragmatic and political, but there's also ways to think and talk about that are more concerned with the country as a whole, the public good, the state of our politics. And so I think there is some awareness on the Biden campaign that that's something possibly worth doing. The difficult challenge will be balancing that interest with the demands of other constituencies in the Democratic Party that are going to be looking for their issues to be promoted. And, we're just going to have to see how that plays out.
All right, Jon Ward. Jon, thank you so much for that very thoughtful, nuanced look at a group that we know was highly influential with the Trump administration. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Elaine.